Hello, and welcome to our combined faith formation classes, the Agape Class and the Young Men's Bible Class, two of our larger adult classes here at First Presbyterian Church, located at 617 North Elm Street at Fisher Park, just north of downtown Greensboro. I'm Lane Ridenhour, and I want to welcome you and thank you for joining us as we gather together here online for worship and study on this, the fifth Sunday after Epiphany, Sunday, February 6th. I say all of that not for the members of our classes who already know this information, but for those of you who might be joining us for the first time, or maybe you stumbled across this video by accident. This hopefully will give you a little background of who we are and why we're here. This week at First Presbyterian Church, our senior minister, the Reverend Jill Duffield, will be preaching at both our 9 o'clock Rejoice contemporary service and our 11 o'clock Sanctuary traditional service. You're cordially invited to worship in person with us here on Elm Street, but if you're unable to be here, we encourage you to go to our church website, www.fpcgreensboro.org. That's www.fpcgreensboro.org. And there you'll find a link to our live stream of our 11 o'clock service, as well as links to our Sunday bulletins and links to other church news and information. Our Professor Sandie Gravett, our teacher, will be joining us in just a few moments as she continues her series of talks on the subject of light, both as seen as the Old and in the New Testament as well. But first, let's warm up our hearts and our minds a bit by the singing of a hymn, Jesus Calls Us. This wonderful hymn was written back in 1856 by Mrs. Cecil Frances Alexander. She was one of the more beloved hymn writers of the 19th century. She wrote more than 400 hymns, and just 2 weeks ago we sang one of her hymns here, All Things Bright and Beautiful. And I mentioned at that time that she also wrote the text to Once in Royal David's City. Like many Christian women of her era, Ms. Alexander was devoted to children's religious education, and she used hymns as a tool to help teach children. Jesus Calls Us, or The Tumult, is sort of an exception in that it was not written as a children's hymn, even though it was written with simple and straightforward language. It focuses on the narrative of Matthew chapter 4, where Jesus is calling the fishermen Andrew and Peter, but it seems to parallel today's lectionary reading, Luke chapter 5, 1 through 11, where Jesus is helping Simon Peter and the other fishermen to catch a large load of fish in the Sea of Galilee. And he tells Simon Peter and the others, from now on, they will be fishers of people. And they left everything and followed him. I'll put the words up on the screen for you and invite you to sing along with me. Jesus Calls Us.
Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of our life's wild restless sea. Day by day his sweet voice soundeth, saying, Christian, follow me. As of old, Saint Andrew heard it by the Galilean lake, turned from home and toil and kindred, leaving all for Jesus' sake. Jesus calls us from the worship of the vain world's golden store, from each idol that would keep us saying, Christian, love me more. In in our joys and in our sorrows, days of toil and hours of ease, still he calls in cares and pleasures, Christian, love me more than these. Jesus calls us by thy mercies, Savior, may we hear thy call. Give our hearts to thine obedience, serve and love thee best of all.
Last week, we heard Jesus say, I am the light of the world, in the Gospel of John. And we thought about what he was saying, not only about himself, but also about what his statement meant for us. I hope, however, that somebody listening last week had this thought. What about Matthew 5? In the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus clearly says to his audience, you are the light of the world. Who's right? Jesus in John or Jesus in Matthew? Can both things be true at the same time? I would say we have a good deal to chew on this week in our Epiphany series on light. To get us started, let me say this. It's not that the idea of Israel, a people who is in relationship to God, being a light to the world, is a new one. For instance, back in Isaiah chapters 49 and 60, the people are being called back from exile, asked to rebuild the city. And the prophet holds out this thought as a possibility. Here's Isaiah 49. It is too light a thing that you should be my servant, to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the survivors of Israel. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. Or look at Isaiah 60. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. In these texts, being a light to the world is imagined as a future, perhaps with just a little bit of a toe in the present. Thus, what we see is predominantly hope, something that God is setting in motion, if only they will do the work. By contrast, in the Gospel of Matthew, the Greek verb is a second-person plural present active indicative. Greek grammarian and teacher Stan Kondrat explains that clearly. He says, present active indicative shows that the action happens in the present time, that the subject carries out the action, and that it is a true statement. The disciples of Jesus thus are, according to Jesus in this gospel, already the light of the world. It is not evolving or waiting for some future moment to be realized, and it is not in question. It is being lived out. Given that this statement comes near the start of Jesus' ministry, you might find the disciples' reference here strange. In fact, in chapter 4, just a few verses prior, we read that Jesus has only called 4 people by this time to follow him. Simon, who is called Peter, and Andrew, his brother, come from casting a net into the sea. Same thing with James, the son of Zebedee, and his brother John. They're in their dad's fishing boat, according to this text, when they come along. The call of Matthew, the purported writer of this story, is not narrated until chapter 9. And the list of the full 12 disciples doesn't happen until the 10th chapter of Matthew. Still, in chapter 4, Jesus has apparently already gained great notoriety before he delivers this extended message. Here we read that he has gone throughout the Galilee, teaching in synagogues, proclaiming the good news, curing diseases and sicknesses among the people, and that his fame is spread throughout Syria, and that great crowds follow him from the Galilee, the Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and from beyond the Jordan. He has made, according to this text, a big splash pretty quickly. Whether or not, then, one would classify the crowds as disciples, since the writer in Matthew 5 at least initially says that Jesus separates himself by going up on the mountain, is unclear. We do need to leave room for the fact that they could rejoin him later and be included amongst those who were called his disciples. But my point is that we have clear indications in the presentation of this material that we aren't to be reading the disciples as the famous specific 12 or as a limited group. When Jesus starts speaking, he teaches them. And while that is a reference to disciples, it is supposed to invoke all of us, the ones who were present, the early church, and the ones who received this tradition. Indeed, Jesus' Sermon on the Mount in Matthew is designed to be Jesus' Moses moment. This discourse is on a mountain, by contrast to Luke, where a similar sermon is given on a plain. At Sinai, the commandments come from God and are meant to inaugurate the forging of a covenant with the people of Israel, telling them at the outset of their long relationship how to live in ways that make them God's people. On Jesus' mountain, we are getting a reinterpretation of that law in a 3-chapter guide to what living as Jesus would see this law, commandment, relationship being enacted entails. Thus, when we look at Jesus' statement, "You are the light of the world," we have to ask what can be made of it in this setting. Augustine, the philosopher, teacher, theologian, and Bishop of Hippo, who lived from the mid-4th to the early 5th centuries, is helpful on this point. He once said, "It's not in the book or in the writer that readers discern the truth of what they read. They see it in themselves, if the light of truth has penetrated their minds." I think the same idea applies here. It is not in the law or commandments, or even in Jesus' teachings on that hillside, that people discover truth. Truth comes, light comes, when we see those precepts, these ways of being, in ourselves as individuals, and when we are part of being it lived out in our communities, here meaning the church. As the rabbis were fond of saying, to truly be realized, the precepts of God must be written on our hearts. They have to be at the core of who we are. If they remain outside of us, distant from us, they cannot ever possibly come to life. But when they are in us, those precepts, those ideas, that piece of God can shine. What is it then that Jesus sees as making for light? We would, I think, need to consider all Jesus says in the sermon to get to that point. We can't do that today. But what we can accomplish is how to notice the way that this declaration comes after Jesus has delivered the Beatitudes, telling the crowd who is blessed, namely the poor in spirit, the mourning, the meek, those who are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, the merciful, the pure in heart, the peacemakers, the ones who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness. This placement of the list, bumping right up against Jesus' declaration about who we are, is not accidental, and I want to read the two of these things together. Let's then switch gears and think about the Beatitudes. They are not by any means what most people's ideas of blessing, what basking in the light of God looks like. Indeed, if you look at what each one indicates and think about the ordinary people who live within the routine concerns of everyday life, Jesus is describing the struggles most folks face, and thus the challenges we all have to confront to get where we want to be in relationship to God. To make that clear, I'm going to take these ideas step by step. If we are poor in spirit, and the word for spirit here is pneuma, meaning breath, wind, or spirit, it means that we have learned that the source of our breath, the source of what inspires us to go on, is not our lungs, and it's not our minds or our hearts. It's God. For most of us, however, breathlessness, dispiritedness is more common. We might be said to live as if life is an uphill climb. What does that mean? It means we rarely find the space or the opportunity in the constancy of our motion to catch our breath or to feel inspired to go on, much less to see that we have a tank full of air available to us, a cheerleader urging us forward. If we are mourning, we are making our grief, our losses visible. There is not one thing wrong or unhealthy about that. Hear me again. There is not one thing wrong or unhealthy about doing such. Indeed, what this verse makes you think about is how we more often resist doing so. We live in a culture that tells us to get up and get on with things, rather than one that helps us make sense of our losses and weave them into our path in ways that can assist us in reorienting and in finding a way forward that builds on our past without getting lost in it. If we are meek, we are likely not forcefully imposing ourselves in the corridors of power and prestige, seeking attention or glory. The adjective here is interesting. What it means, actually, is gentle. In writing on this word, minister and scholar Spiros Zoadites writes, according to Aristotle, this term is in the middle, standing between two extremes, getting angry without reason and not getting angry at all. What we're really talking about is getting angry at the right time, in the right measure, and for the right reasons. It's not an idea that moves smoothly into English, because meekness for us suggests timidity or weakness. But this word is a condition of the mind and heart which demonstrates gentleness, not in weakness, but in power. In other words, when we are meek, we know something about when to press our case, and we know how to do so in such a way that we are always kind and thoughtful and demonstrate care and concern, rather than in ways that advance our ego or forefront our need for attention and control. If we are hungry and thirsty for righteousness, it means we are not seeing it, namely justice enacted in the world, and thus we are always seeking to do that work because we need justice, righteousness to be realized as much as we need to eat and to drink. God is, as the biblical witness demonstrates, always on the side of the oppressed, and that oppression has real and material effects that have to be alleviated, not spiritualized. We are thus to be about service, to be about bringing justice if we confess the reality of the kingdom of God is being made present in our time. If we are merciful, that's all good. It means that we're capable of understanding the limitations of being human and know that when others fall short of whatever is required, when they disappoint us, and even when they cause harm, they often need our support and our care more than retribution or punishment. And just as often, we need the same thing. If we are pure in heart, It means that we understand the need to stay oriented toward God, even if we don't always do it. The outcome is what strikes me here. The pure in heart will see God. It reminds me of the Hebrew Bible when God tells Moses, "You can't see my face, for no one shall see my face and live." That's Exodus 33:20, if you want to look it up. In other words, most of us never attain the kind of purity of heart that can give us a view of God, not even a glimpse. Indeed, most of the disciples see Jesus full on every day, and yet they struggle to recognize the divine right in front of them. It's thus a real effort to keep our hearts from clouding over in ways that obscure God. And by effort, I mean having the disciplined focus to keep recognizing where we are weak in this regard and figuring out how to improve our eyesight, how to improve our discernment, how to focus our attention. If we are peacemakers, we're people who are always looking for options that help individuals and communities reconcile their differences, because we want them to experience wholeness and healing. Let's face it, that's tough work. Former Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who died recently, was famous for saying, "If you want peace, you don't talk to your friends, you talk to your enemies." That choice, however, is a rare one to make because it requires investment in seeing beyond ourselves, our wants, and our needs. It might even require us to look at things that we find deeply troubling, and yet not to give up or to give in. And if we are persecuted or reviled for the sake of righteousness, it means that we get that the ways we are called to live toward God, to enact real justice, often go counter to what the world values. This particular beatitude is not so much about lauding ourselves for being willing to step out and do this work either. It is about risking loss. Are you willing to take stands that could result in people whispering about you in your social circle, perhaps even losing friendships or family relationships? And then, of course, there are other kinds of losses. We can all think of the people who are willing to do the right thing at the expense of their bodies and even their lives. From this vantage point, being light in the world looks like a pretty daunting prospect, because it is. Fortunately, we don't have to go it alone. "You are the light of the world" is a collective statement. That "you" is a second person plural, meaning you are, as a church, as a community of people, to be dedicated to living this way. If we manage to be about this work, however, there is still more to be said about what being such a light entails. Jesus, in fact, goes on to say, "A city built on a hill cannot be hid." Now, there are all kinds of reasons cities are constructed on hilltops, but the primary one is defense. You can see trouble coming from a long way off. Jesus, however, is turning this idea around, and he is reminding people that as such a community, we need to be in a location that is also quite visible. Indeed, visibility is desirable for a community that wants to spread such positivity. And yet it requires something, doesn't it? It requires that the church, that the community be seen as something that draws people to it. It has to be something that people see as beautiful and desirable and want to move toward. Enter light. No one, he says, after lighting a lamp, puts it under the bushel basket, but rather it goes on the lampstand and it gives light to all the house. If you turn on, in the modern vernacular, a lamp, Jesus says, if you start living in the way that the Beatitudes have stressed, that following God's precepts has taught, you don't hide that away. You don't try to prevent people from seeing the light that such a life produces. You set it up out there where its light can spread and illuminate more square footage, more city blocks, more territory altogether. If you don't do that, why are you bothering to make the effort? Light can't be light if it is not allowed to do its job, and that job is illuminate. To understand this point, I think of the great Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who says, judging others makes us blind, whereas love is illuminating. It's a clear insight on the church at this point, if you think about it. Too often, people see the church not as a light, not as something that illumines the things within and around its walls, but rather as a closed-off space, a space that is filled with the blind and makes itself blind to the realities of the world. I mean blind to the sorrows and the pains of those both within and without, and all too fast to judge that which it never truly sees. I like this cartoon in that regard. Yeah, you were a believer, but you skipped the not being a jerk about it part. The church frequently is not the place of love it is meant to be, the place that sheds light on all kinds of human darkness and takes on the work of transforming that darkness, bringing that light in whatever ways that it can manage. Jesus, in fact, says as much. In the same way, he goes on, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Our ways as the church, as being the people of God, are supposed to be visible. Now, he's quick to add that they are not to be about us. This light that we produce is not to turn the spotlight on ourselves, but rather to demonstrate that the light of the world is God, and we are simply bearers of it. Thus, it is not by chance that this sermon continues from this point with these words in the next section. I love this transition. Jesus says, don't think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill them. Jesus is reminding his audience that this business of God is not new. He's reminding them that they stand as followers in a long and ancient tradition of God in relationship to humanity, and that God has always been pushing towards the same goals, that God has always been about light, and they may not have always been heard as clearly as they might have been. They certainly have not always been enacted as well as they might be. But God has never given up on being light to us or on trusting us to become illumination for others right here, right now. And that leads me to one final mistake that we frequently make as the church. We often expect that God will handle all the work, and all we have to do is endure to the end, when everything will be right on the other side, when that light will finally be visible and we will dwell in it. Maybe Walt Whitman speaks against that notion of looking to that distant future best when he says, pointing to another world will never stop vice among us. Shedding light over this world can alone help us. Thus, what does Jesus say? You are the light of the world. We as the church are the light of the world. It is a great promise, and it is an enormous responsibility. And it leaves us with the question, will we be that light? Thank you once again for your attention, and I will look forward to continuing this series with you next week.